first of all, why business model canvas? Why is this an important tool? And what it can help you do. We'll do an introduction to the actual canvas itself and its primary building blocks and how you use them. And we'll use a few examples to demonstrate its usage. And finally, we will cover a few different uses of the canvas, specifically how you can use it to describe your business or to prototype your business at the same time as you prototype your product, how you can use it to optimize and stress test how good your business is, and also how you can innovate using it. But before I start, I would like to ask you the following question. I suppose some of you actually have already used the business model canvas. So if we can perhaps have a show of hands of who is familiar already with the canvas and who is not, so I have a sense of how much I need to go in depth. So if you raise your hand, that means that you're familiar with the canvas. Let's just have a quick sense. All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have about 6, 7 people who already have seen the canvas and who are familiar with it. So for the benefit of those that are not, what I'm going to do is quickly introduce the building blocks, but spend a little bit more time on talking about the uses of the canvas. And perhaps we can have as well a conversation with those of you who have used it before, where you may have some specific questions. So, why the business model canvas? Why is it an important tool? So as an entrepreneur, one of your main jobs is building a fantastic product, but that is not sufficient. While you're building a product, you also need to build a sound business. And to build a sound business, you need some help to think about all of the different component parts of that business. So a business model is nothing more than just a story that describes how your business delivers value, who it delivers it to, and how that makes you money. So the business model canvas is simply that tool, that map that allows us to think about the business itself in a structured way so that we don't forget important components of it. The canvas itself is composed just of 9 elements that are exactly these key building blocks that are important to describe a business and also to examine how good or how solid and sound that business is. So I'm going to go through each one of the building blocks very quickly to describe what the story sounds like. So in the middle is one of our most important building blocks, which is the value proposition of your business. The value proposition is simply the problem you're solving and the fundamental joy you create or the pain you relieve for your customer. It is not a list of features. So you sell your value proposition to a customer segment. That is our furthest right-hand side component part. The customer segment is not just a demographic. It is a very specific person that you can describe, or persons that you can describe, who have that problem that you're solving. The more specific you are about describing your customer segment, the better it is for you. A business model can have multiple customer segments, so that is perfectly fine. Now, so you have your value proposition, which you deliver to a customer segment, whom you reach through some channels. Channels can be of different kinds. Channels are things that help you get known. Channels are things that help you sell. Channels also help you reach your customer after you have sold the product. So they actually impact the entire life cycle of a product. So channels can be of different kinds depending on which part of the life cycle you're talking about. So you can have online channels, you can have offline channels, and you have a multitude of those. And you'll be describing these in your business model. You also have an ongoing relationship with your customer. And that relationship describes how often you interact with your customer, how easy it is for you to have a repeat purchase, or how much retention and lock-in you have with your customer. This is a component part of the business model that is very important, because we'll be looking at how you can increase lock-in and retention and decrease churn. And all of this makes you some money. So you have a value proposition that you deliver to a certain customer segment, whom you reach through a set of channels, with whom you maintain as well an ongoing relationship. And at the end of the day, they pay you something. So the something that they pay you is an important component of the business model as well, because there's different kinds of revenue you can have. So what you'll be looking here at is, are your revenues one-off? Are they repeating? What is the shape and the curve of your revenues, and how often you may be getting them from customers? So this concludes the right-hand side of the canvas, which is the customer-facing side. Now, in order to do all of this, you need to create that value proposition. So we're looking at the left-hand side of the canvas now. To create the value propositions, you have to do certain activities. And what we're particularly interested in here are activities that are key and core to deliver the value proposition. So there may be plenty of different things that the business needs to do, like finances and hiring and all that, but only certain activities are specific for delivering the value proposition that the business has. You also will be using some key resources. So these are assets that you have. And the best way to think about them is they're things that somebody will acquire you for. They are a competitive advantage for you. Often there's a question about how activities are different from resources. And when you're starting a business, many things you will be doing at first will be manual. So there will be actual activities. Once you automate and you create ways of using technology to do some of these things, actually the technology itself becomes a resource. Here we're thinking about resources that are not only traditional assets, but for example, resources such as the community of customers that you have, or the data that you're gathering from them, or any know-how that is managed in such a way that you can reuse it in a technological way. And all of these things that you do in order to create the value proposition, of course, cost you money. Here again, what we're looking at is not all of the costs you have, but the major ones, the ones that are significant and that determine the dynamic of your business. And particularly the question you'll be asking yourself is, what kind of costs are we having? Are they recurring, one-off? Are they setup costs, unit costs? What are our marginal costs? What's the shape of my cost curve compared to my revenue? And this will be an important component to optimize our business model. And the final element of the business model is actually partners. So anything that is not a core activity for the business, that is not a competitive advantage, or that can be done by somebody better than you, you would outsource, and you will use that, you will have there a partner. So a partner can for any of the activities in the other boxes of the business model canvas, for example, channels or relationships, or activities and resources, as long as these are not critical and core to your business. What you do not want to be doing is outsourcing component parts that actually are determining the competitiveness of your business model to somebody else. And here also you will be using questions to determine what is the relationship you have with a partner. How can you, for example, take a partner and transform them into a customer, or can you have some sort of a shared revenue model with them? And this basically is what the business model canvas is. These are the 9 building blocks, and you use them to describe any business in this shape. What's the value proposition? To whom are you delivering it? In what way are you reaching them? How are you retaining them? What are they paying you? What do you do in order to produce this value proposition? What does it cost you? And who helps you? So far, so good. Any questions at this point on just the description? Nope.
Yeah, at the moment we seem to be okay.
Excellent. So let's take an example. So this is a typical business model of an airline company. Any airline company, British Airways in this case, but it could be any of them. So how do we describe a business model for an airline company? So the value proposition, the thing that sits in the middle, is very simple. We offer travel from point A to point B over a certain distance. Why over a certain distance? Because air travel only makes sense when we're talking about distances that are longer than what you can travel by car or by train. Who are you offering this to? Well, you can be offering it to a number of different customer segments. Business travelers, for example, families, or budget EU travel, which is not something that the airline companies initially wanted to have, but had to have in order to stay competitive. So how do you reach these people? Generally today, through Google Ads or comparison sites and travel sites that advertise different airline packages. How about retention? What is the relationship you have with these people? Most of the time, it's a one-off relationship. Even if people buy multiple times a ticket from a given air company, the actual acquisition cost of that person is always the same. So the comparison sites will still need to be functioning and so forth. The only kind of the only kind of retention we have, which is a little bit stronger, is air miles. Why? Because these provide a mechanism for enticing people to choose a particular company over another one when other competitive advantages don't exist. And this results in your revenue streams, which in this case, it's ticket sales, super simple. On the other side, we have the key activities, resources, and cost structure that allow us to deliver this travel from A to B value proposition. The main things that an airline company needs to do is operate flights, sell tickets, and perhaps do some advertising. You can argue how important that is to their business. The resources that they have, that are things that actually somebody would acquire them for, apart from the typical things that any other company has, like planes and stuff, are takeoff slots. These are really valuable assets. Or the executive members, these being the members of the air mile clubs that you're having retention with. You also have from their contact details and data, which is also a valuable resource that you could be acquired for. The cost structure is also quite typical for an airline company. There's a lot of costs that are locked costs and fixed over time. They're sunk. So the planes and the maintenance themselves are a huge cost to the airline company. The staff, the fuel, the taxis, and perhaps some advertising and etc. And finally, there's some partners that an airline works with in order to deliver this value proposition, which relate to the channels and the relationships in this case. So comparison sites, things like Amex, etc., may be the partners that they use in order to deliver these component parts. So this is how you describe a business using the business model canvas. And there's a couple of things to point out here. One is that you don't need to be precise and super detailed when you describe the business. The goal is to describe only the important component parts that actually can allow you to examine the dynamic of the business, the things that make it different from another business, and be able to test and stress test a little bit how strong your business is. Anything else, you just don't say, you drop. It's not that important. It's also a sketch. So it's a sketch that allows you to think about your business and to ask questions that are relevant and not to be a set in stone thing that you put on a wall. So it's a useful tool to think about. A business model canvas basically is a thinking tool, a tool that allows you to structure the kinds of questions you may want to ask about your business and to examine multiple variations of it cheaply without having to actually test it in real life. So how do we use then the business model canvas for different things? Apart from just describing a business, we use it to also prototype a business. And what prototyping means is that you may want to try multiple different variations of not just your product, but how your product meets the market. And do this before you actually even have a product or even before you have a business. For example, you may be willing to create different variations where you examine different kinds of value proposition, hypothetically, that you could create, different customer segments that you may target. It may allow you to test for these different pairs of value proposition and customer segments, what are the different ways you can charge, or what are the different ways you can reach them. Which of these would be the most expensive to build or the least expensive to build? Which ones are the ones that are strongest from a retention point of view, and why? Which of these variations allow you to create assets that may become valuable in the future, and so forth. So doing this on paper is a much cheaper way of testing multiple versions and finding the ones that are worth actually implementing in real life than doing it straight in the market. The second thing that you would do with the business model canvas is, especially if you're early on in the development of your business, is to use it to optimize and stress test both your idea of how you should run a business, but also the businesses of your competitors or what exists in the market. And here we're going to do a few different variations to see what are the different elements of the business model canvas you look at in order to look for optimization. So let's take again our example with British Airways. So the first question you would ask yourself when you're looking at a business model canvas like this is to ask, well, where are the weaknesses? Where are the elements in the business model that make it not so strong, not so appealing, or commercially difficult? And one of those is the bottom part, is the revenue streams versus cost structure. And it is a difficult area because the two things have very different shape. If you think about what a revenue curve looks like for an airline company versus what a cost curve looks like, they're very different in shape. Revenues are seasonal. They're one-off. They're very unpredictable, and you cannot say when you will have what kind of revenue. On the other side, on the cost side, you have fixed costs. And those are there whether you get revenues or you don't. Planes still need to be paid for, staff still needs to be there. The only variability may be in the consumption of fuel. And so one of the ways so this is a weakness in this business model canvas. So the big question you would ask yourself is, how can I optimize this? What can I do in order to remove this weakness, in order to change this relationship between the revenue and the cost curves? And one of the ideas you could use, for example, is to say, well, perhaps we can change the revenue streams so that they are not as unpredictable, and perhaps they're a little bit more fixed. And perhaps there's a way to change the cost structure so that it is relative to the revenue streams. So if I only have to pay for my biggest assets when I know I have revenue coming in, I basically solve my problem. So how could I do this? So here we're going to examine a different business model that plays on an airline company, but does a completely different thing. So instead of going for any travel from A to B, we're going to pick a very specific value proposition. Regular travel on frequent commuter routes. And we're going to target not everybody, but a very specific customer segment, which is regular business travelers. So what that means is that we'll basically look for routes where business people travel every week, and several of them do so. So frequently used air routes for business travelers. And we're looking for people who travel all the time on these routes. So every week they commute to another place. And it's the same place. So these are people who live in one place, work in another place, or where companies have offices in different locations, where it's accepted for people to travel to the office once a week and commute this way. Now, this is particularly the case in the US. It's not the case everywhere in Europe, but there's also certain European locations where this kind of travel patterns exist. So if I find this type of people and I have this value proposition, suddenly I can solve a pain point they have. Their pain point is that they need to fly every week and they waste a lot of time in airports, sitting at airports, security stuff, getting to the airports and so forth. So if I can solve that pain point on one side, and I can give them a subscription model where they pay a monthly fee for having a flight every week or as much as they want. So basically it's the all-you-can-eat buffet in airline. Then I can actually create a completely different equation between my revenues and my cost structures. Because the only thing I need to do then is rent charter planes that are small enough, fly them out of small airports, provide perhaps Uber as a service to get people to the airport and from the airport to either home or, and get rid of all the security hassle and all the rest of it, because at smaller airports I will not have these issues. So this actually is my business model in many different ways. So first of all, I create a much stronger value proposition for these business travelers because they have a predictable cost. They know they can travel every week. They don't need to book and spend time to do this all the time. They also save a lot of time in the actual travel. They have a comfortable flight. They have a taxi to take them from home to the plane and the other way around, and they're happy. Me, on the other hand, I have much lower costs because now I'm renting charters, which cost less than big planes. My fuel and staff costs are very limited as well. My taxis are practically negligible because I'm flying out of small airports. I have a little bit more cost for paying for the Ubers because I'll include it in the subscription model, but that is covered for in my revenue stream. I need to change my partnerships because now I don't need all the other stuff that I was doing before. I probably will spend a lot less time on ticket sales, advertising, and all that stuff because I can target specific companies that I know sit on these routes and specific people that I may need to pay a little bit for Google Ads, but not that much because once people know about me, actually, I have a much stronger retention. So apart from the fact that my revenue and cost structure has changed, now I have a much, much stronger retention model as well, because once somebody has paid for a monthly subscription, first of all, I can make them even longer. But once somebody has paid for it, it's money in my pocket, whether they use it or not. So this is a way you can look at a business model canvas, examine some of its weaknesses, and then play with ideas to break these. Of course, by doing this, you introduce perhaps new weaknesses in this business model. So for example, in this case, I cannot scale this indefinitely. And the way to scale it would be to go to locations where similar kind of travel patterns exist. But I would not be able to scale it to the level of a big airway company. So that may be okay with me as an entrepreneur, because even though I cannot scale that much, it's still a business that allows me to grow quite well. And it has a very, very healthy financials. I'm going to stop here again and see if there's any questions. By the way, this company does exist and it's called Surfair. It did launch in the States first. And I think a couple of years ago, tried to move to the UK. I haven't followed up to see whether they did manage, but it has been quite successful in the States. Rafa, do we have any questions?
I don't see any, I don't think so. So I think we're good to go. Again, I repeat for maybe the latecomers, there's two ways to ask questions. You can use the chat and send me a private message, or to everyone. Or you can also raise your hand, which is a feature in Zoom, in which case I will unmute you and you can interact directly with Mariela.
Okay, so let's take another example. And this is a typical hotel example. So it's also something that should be quite familiar for everybody. So first of all, if you look at what the business looks like, the value proposition of a hotel is super simple. You're offering basically a place to stay and sleep. Who are you offering this to? Travelers, mainly. The channels that typically a hotel nowadays uses to reach these people is booking.com or airlines, Expedia, and so forth. So all of the different types of sites that target specifically travelers, as well as more traditional methods like magazines or advertisement in other hotels. The relationship of a hotel with traveler is similar to the airline one. It is basically a one-off relationship, and the only kind of more engaging component you may have that ensures some sort of a return or some sort of a repeat use is the rewards program. So this may encourage people to use you more than once and to use you more regularly when they have the choice. The revenue part is similar to the airlines as well. It's a pay per night, and there may be some additional services that are offered, such as food and beverage that people would consume on the fly. That could be variable. On the other side, of course, we have the key activities, resources, and the cost associated with those, being the hotel management and marketing as a key activity, and the main resources being the assets themselves. So the hotels, the brand, which is quite important to some of the bigger chain hotels, the staff, and there may be some other assets such as procedures that are being followed, a way for guests to be welcomed and so forth, which becomes a signature of the hotel, and data about the people who stay there. These things cost, and again, similar to the airlines, these are fixed costs. And again, we have this issue of the cost and revenue streams not being matched properly. In this case, we're going to try a slightly different type of optimization of this business model. So first of all, one of the things we will try to fix is the fact that typically travelers are not people that would always pay a lot of money for a hotel. So our margins are not particularly good. So the first thing we're going to attempt to do is change our margins in order to decrease the investment we have in our assets and to be able to pay for our assets faster. So to do that, we're going to play on the segments. So we're going to try to target different kinds of segments as well, potentially some that may have better margins, so we can sell them the same kind of asset at a higher cost. And we're also going to play on the value proposition, therefore, because in order to satisfy some of these new customer segments, we probably need to offer other services. So one of the first things we can add is business travelers as a specific segment that we can charge more to for the same thing. We may need to change slightly our location or our amenities or the service we offer and so forth in order to cater for these people. But overall, we'll be able to get better margin for the same kind of thing.
Mariela,
Yes.
we have a question from Martine. Martine,
Sure.
I'm going to unmute you so that you can interact directly with Mariela. If it lets me. Strange.
You can't?
Yeah, I'm clicking on the button a couple of times. I'm not sure why it's not working. Oh, and now Here you go, maybe.
No, sorry, I pushed the wrong button.
Here we go. We can
Right,
hear
we
you
hear
now.
you. Perfect.
Yeah. So
Yes.
I pushed the wrong button. Sorry for that.
Oh, okay. You didn't have a question. I see.
No.
Understood. All right. So apart from the fact that we can add business travelers in order to increase our margins, there's a second thing, of course, we can do, which is think about how we can use our assets when they're not used in a different way. And this is where event organizers and space for hire comes as another value proposition we can add in order to improve our business model. So this is a way you can basically make the business model look a little bit better, allow you to even out a little bit better your revenue and your cost structures, but it will not, for example, solve some of the other issues. For example, it will change absolutely nothing to your relationship with the customer. And your retention will be exactly the same as it was before, which is not particularly good. Now, let me see, oops. To give you a little bit more sense of a structured approach of how you can think about all of these different ways of stress testing and optimizing the business model, here's a few different questions that you may systematically want to explore when you're prototyping a business model or when you're looking to assess the business model either of a competitor or of an existing player in the marketplace. So the first one would be around the value proposition. So the question there is, what are the real pain points that aren't being solved today? And the way you would look for these is looking for places where people are hacking it, where people are self-solving issues. These are perfect opportunities to add to the value proposition and create something new and solve it in a substantial way. The second thing you'll look at is new customer segments. So can you add a segment to the business model canvas that will either help you use the assets already have in a different way, it will change your revenue streams, it will add to a revenue stream, or it can, for example, create a value that another customer segment could use. For example, this is the case of marketplaces and platforms. Typically, you'll be looking as well for niche customers, specifically those that are indicative of emerging needs. So for example, looking at the needs of the younger population or the trendsetters allows you to experiment and learn with the value proposition that eventually will become, and actually quite quickly nowadays, would become much more mainstream. Then the third thing you'll be looking at, and that's what we've been talking about actually with most of the examples, is this decreasing churn. So how do you create stickiness? Because stickiness means that it's very difficult for another competitor to steal your customers. So what it is that you can do in order to retain a customer so that it is very difficult for them to move someplace else. And let's be very clear, loyalty is probably the worst way we can think of creating stickiness. It doesn't really do it. People feel trapped. And often, as soon as they have the possibility to not use it, they will move away. Did we have a comment? Rafa?
Yeah, we've had a couple of questions. So Sai is asking if there is a sequence in which you tailor the business model to look at alternatives. For example, start with customer first or cost first or both.
Yes. So it depends a little bit when you're doing this and for what purpose. But if I assume that you're an entrepreneur and you are starting to develop your business, so you're early stage, you have an idea, and you're basically at the point when you're figuring out how to go about it, the first type of things that you will be looking at is the value proposition and the customer segment. Because basically, having a value proposition that is valid and strong and a customer segment that really cares for it is the most fundamental thing that makes a business work. The rest you can optimize and you can find ways in which you can scale, as long as you have that value proposition customer segment fit that is strong enough. So typically what entrepreneurs will do is they will use the business model canvas to prioritize their experimentation. And the first type of experiments they will run are around, is there a real problem and does somebody care?
Thank you, Mariela. We also had an intervention of Michael or Michael. I'm sorry if I said any of the names wrong, by the way. That says that the business model canvas is a valuable tool for founders, especially in time like this, with the coronavirus. Yes. and the crisis and the difficulty.
Absolutely, and I will give you an example that I came across recently, which is a startup that the normal business is basically creating modular housing. And what they do is they have created a technology that allows them to pre-package housing modules so that all of the required systems as well are part of that. So it's a construction startup. And with what they did with very little tweaking of their methodology, they basically use the same production facilities, just changing the plans to produce hospitals modules of different types. So with the electricity units, with the hygiene setup and the whole shebang that is necessary in packages that can be loaded on a truck, like 16 packages on a single truck, and transported very easily to different locations. So this was literally looking at the bit which is actually number 8 in my picture at the moment, which is saying, look at my key resources and the things that I know how to do. Given the fact that there is a new problem on the table, can I repurpose my resources to solve this new problem? So that is one of the typical ways actually companies are using the business model canvas to find extensions to their business and business innovations. And Amazon Web Services is one of the examples that is often quoted in this space, because they basically took a resource that they had sitting there, not used all the time, which is computing power, and turned it into a completely new business. Any other questions or comments at this point?
At this point, no. I'll cut you if any new questions or comments arise.
So to come back to some of the other questions you may want to ask yourself in order to optimize the business model canvas is around channels. So can you scale your channels? And that has to do with having a better reach, having a more targeted reach, using viral channels as much as possible. So viral meaning that each customer that you reach actually allows you to reach several other customers in turn, so that it becomes a little bit of a snowball effect without you having to invest for every single customer that you want to reach separately. Actually turn the channels into an asset you sell. And you can think about all of the chat and communication, social media type of apps and services that we have, where they have done actually exactly that. They have created the capability of reaching a captive audience, and that capability has become the platform on which they have built other businesses. Think of Snapchat, WeChat, and so forth, WeChat in particular. So thinking of channels as an asset is actually one of the new ways we're thinking about assets, which before the digital era were very physical. Now more and more assets are much more ephemeral and digital, and customer groups themselves and the way to reach them is an asset. You may also as well want to look at changing your revenue streams. As we looked at the different examples, actually we've examined this quite much in detail, and there are a couple of components there. One is to change the number of revenue streams, change what people pay for, so value-based versus cost-based pricing, subscription models, which give you a much more consistent and predictable revenue model, and then paying for add-ons, which is the freemium model, is what it's called basically, where additional features can bring you additional revenue. So you have a way to incentivize people to buy additional parts of your value proposition. Partners is another thing you can look at in terms of what you can optimize. One of the ways to do this is to figure out a way to transform them into customers. Can you take them from sitting on the left-hand side and actually deliver a service to them as well? And could you share the risk with customers, for example, by having shared revenues instead of paying, with partners, instead of paying to a partner for a service? One of the ways you want to deal with partnerships is to think about how much would it take you to acquire the capability as well, and what is the benefit of having somebody else do something rather than you acquiring this and having it as an asset. At the moment, we see a proliferation of interesting business models as well that innovate in the space, which are all the ecosystem business models, where in fact, partners are not just somebody you buy something from, but they become a critical component of creating a value proposition. So think about all of the ways APIs, for example, can allow you to add on to an existing value proposition new features. And one of the best examples in this space is Xero, the online accounting app, where the basic value proposition of Xero is very simple. It's just an accounting package, but it allows a huge ecosystem of more than 400 partners to plug into this accounting package and provide additional services, so that, for example, as you're doing your accounting, you suddenly realize you need FX. You can click on a button and plug in an FX application. Or you grow to a stage where you need proper HR functions and payrolls to be implemented. You click on another button and you have all of these available and implement it immediately. So it allows a very small company with very few resources to provide an overall experience and value proposition which competes with huge providers such as SAP. And the innovative part of this business model is the fact as well that this entire ecosystem looks and feels like a single business, because there is an incentive both for the partners and Xero to play together as they share revenue. And then the last piece of innovation, which we haven't talked about yet, is the squeezing costs, but we saw it in the examples before, which is, again, thinking about what are your biggest costs and how can you remove them? Can you automate? Can you transform something that is heavy and manual into an asset, which becomes much cheaper over time? Can you get others to do it cheaper? Or can you transform something that is a cost into a revenue generating opportunity? Any questions?
Not for now, but let's see if anyone would like to take this moment to ask one. We have one, Mela, from Nick.
Yep.
On point 6, partnerships. Can an Airbnb fall in this segment of shared value?
So actually, we can look at it because I have the business model smack there. So there's a number of so partnerships in Airbnb actually are slightly different. So let me just put it up. So Airbnb is actually something slightly different. So it's not an ecosystem necessarily, unless if you consider all of the new businesses that have started to appear around Airbnb, like cleaning services, lock-in services, etc., as a part of the ecosystem. And those are the ones that could be considered as partnerships where there's a revenue share. But the people who provide the homes are actually customer segment that is not a partner, but this is what is called platform. So it's a two-sided platform or marketplace where you have two different customer segments that are completely intertwined. So I'm going to go actually through this example in a bit more detail so that you see how it works. But the partnership question only applies to some of the newer kind of partners that have started appearing around Airbnb. So it wasn't a purposeful design on their side. It was something that happened. They took advantage of it as well. But basically, all of the local services within each of the locations where there's lots of Airbnbs available are now part of their partners' ecosystem. They don't do tons of stuff with them, unfortunately. But I'm sure at some point they will start using them much more effectively. Does that answer the question on the partners? I suppose, yes. There is something else blinking.
But Martine has her hand raised again. I tried to reach out to her. Yeah, no, it probably was a mistake once again. Nick did answer Mela and says yes, thanks. You did answer.
Good. Super. So the last piece that I wanted to spend a little bit of time on, which is exactly using the Airbnb model, is to talk about how the business model canvas can be used to innovate. And, you hear a lot of people say that basically today, nowadays, the most significant and disruptive type of innovation that is happening is not technological innovation, but it's really business model innovation. And what that means is that basically we're questioning the fundamental principles behind the way different industries work and changing the rules of the game. And that's what really business model innovation means. If you take any industry and you look at what are the ways the business has always worked and what are the assumptions, the fundamental assumptions behind this business, you can find innovation basically happening in breaking these assumptions. Some of these work, some of these don't work. So assumptions are things like, in order to run a hotel, you need to have real estate. In order to run a taxi company, you have taxis and so forth. But it could be as well other assumptions, such as in order to have a healthy business, you need to actually have a company with staff that you pay, and you need to have a product that people pay for, and it's not free. And the freemium model has actually broken a number of these things together with the open source development community. So we are at a point in time where many of our industries are going through explorations of this kind, where many of the assumptions of the basic ways of doing business are being questioned and experimented with. And so we'll use the typical hotel industry just as a demonstration to show how one of these ways of breaking assumptions, one of these ways of innovating, is portrayed on a business model canvas, and also to introduce one of the new kind of business models that is becoming prevalent in any industry, the platform business model, or the multi-sided marketplace. So if you remember, the typical hotel business model had those yellow stickers only in place. So you had a place to stay or sleep without the less. That was the typical value proposition. You had the travelers, the business people, and all these guys that you were targeting. You were reaching these through a whole bunch of different channels. There wasn't tons of retention happening because only you had rewards as a possibility. They were paying for the room, so that was your revenue stream. And then you had a whole bunch of assets and costs associated with running the hotel. Now, what Airbnb basically did is said, well, how can you deliver this value proposition? A place to stay, and let's make it more interesting, a place to stay for less, without having the costs, without needing the assets. And this is where the innovation came. So the point of the innovation was to say, how do we find a way to places to stay that need to own and buy ourselves? And this is where they discovered the other part of the equation, which is, well, there are people that have places where others can stay. We just need to create the mechanic that allows to match those that need it with those that have it. And this is basically what a platform business is. But in order for a platform business to work well, you need to have two parts of it. So two customer segments, each one providing the value proposition. So one providing the value proposition for the other one, but both need to have a very strong reason why they want to participate in this. So there needs to be value proposition for both of them. So in the case of Airbnb, we have our main segment, which is the travelers again, who will be getting a place to stay. And in this case, the key to their value proposition is that it's going to be for less. At least this was the case initially. Now, the proposition of Airbnb has evolved, but initially that's how it was competing against hotels, particularly for families. And we're going to have the homeowners, which is our second segment, homeowners with spare capacity, who will be providing the place to stay. In order to make them do that, however, we need to solve some of their problems. Today, they don't do this because, one, it's difficult to find travelers. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes money. Two, it's risky because you never know who you're going to get. And if anything happens, it is very difficult for you to recover the costs. And three, there's other stuff that makes it a little bit more complicated, with such as, how do you advertise well? How do you attract people? And that takes skill and it takes time. So Airbnb solved that for the homeowners. So it said, in order to get them to do what we need them to do, which is provide capacity, provide sleeping places, we will actually take on the risk on their behalf. So we will have an insurance cover and we will deal with the payment, and we will create a system that allows for voting and reviews of both homeowners and travelers in order to be able to vet people to a certain extent. On top of that, we're going to provide them with some other services that will make their life easier, such as photographers who will make their entry look really interesting and exciting, and we will take care of this whole looking for the travelers problem. So that's really the key of this value proposition. What does it change in the whole equation? Well, suddenly you're running a business where you can expand indefinitely as long as you can find more homeowners and more travelers without having to invest much in it, because all the resources you need to run this is a tech, a platform that does the matching. And once you build it, it is there. It can take care of as much traffic as you want, as many new customers as you want. So this is a very, very strong business model, but it's also very tricky. Note the difference here in the revenue streams. So suddenly you have two revenue streams, first of all, to start with. Not only, it's not just paying for a room, but you actually have revenue streams coming from both the travelers and the homeowners, which are acceptable to them because they only are there when a match happens. So when there isn't a match, there is no cost to either party. You're not getting any revenue, but you're not having any costs either. When there is a match, when there is a sale happening, you're taking a cut. So this makes it a super extensible business model. The difficulty in it is that creating this dynamic of platform requires sufficient capacity to be available on both sides. So you need to have enough people that are offering their homes and enough travelers that are willing to go to that place. And that is a very, very tricky equation to balance well. And unfortunately, there's no formula that you can just plug in numbers into and it works. So a lot of the experimentation that entrepreneurs who work with platforms need to do is figuring out what are the right dynamics of this type of business model, because each type of platform is going to have different dynamic. And what do you feed first? Do you first create capacity of the homes, or do you first create interest in the travelers, or do you do both at the same time? And each one has its pros and cons, and this is where prototyping and experimentation comes into play to help you test some of these assumptions. And this is a typical business model where you need to test it. Uber is very different, even though it's also a platform, is a very different model and dynamic than Airbnb. So Uber, for example, saturates the market first with capacity. So it first attacks the drivers, and only then it starts advertising to the travelers or to the taxi customers. Airbnb works at the same time. That was the choice they made, and they found that this works for their kind of thing. Other platforms may first actually create the demand and only then start creating the supply. So each one will be different. Here, what's interesting as well with Airbnb is that over time, their business model has evolved. So for example, initially, photographers were not part of the value proposition at all. Homeowners were supposed to send pictures themselves, and what Airbnb found out is that their success rate increased if professional photographs were being taken. So they started providing this as a service because that created a much stronger revenue stream for them, because there were much more matches, which resulted basically in more booking fees and reservation fees for them. The second thing that Airbnb is starting to do now, and we haven't really seen a lot of it out yet, is that over time they have been able to build an enormous amount of intelligence about cities, and cities from different points of view. From the point of view of places in the city that are priced differently, real estate value, also the characteristics of the different cities. So for example, they have very good ability to predict nowadays what is a typical usage ratio for a given city if you're a homeowner. So what is the kind of typical occupation you can rely on if you're a first-time homeowner that is offering their home for rent. And this is something that was not there at the beginning, but as evolved and as they run their and collect data from their model, they actually start understanding how each city is different and start offering this intelligence as a service to the homeowners upfront. So when you join, you know in a fairly predictable way what is the kind of revenue you could be getting. And so they offer a special kind of advice services now to homeowners. They haven't a lot with the real estate data yet, but we can start seeing this, for example, appearing as a way for them to create a completely new business and new service. So that, for example, will appear as a key resource. It's not at the moment in the business model, but it will appear as a key resource once that data becomes usable. And that key resource then, similarly to what Amazon did with their computing power, can be used to create an business model where you sell it to people that do urban development or who do real estate development or construction companies in order to do better reconnaissance, pricing, and so forth, investments in real estate. So this is an example of how you would innovate using a business model by taking one of the key assumptions that exist in a business and turning it on its head and running the rest of the business to see what else changes, in what way you need to change every single component part of the business in order to make it work. And this is actually all I had in order to share with you in terms of, what are some of the ways that the business model canvas can be used by entrepreneurs, but also by any other organization in order to, one, talk about their business, describe it, two, prototype and test different options when you're experimenting with a new idea, three, optimize and strengthen their business or discover the weaknesses in competitor businesses, and four, challenge the assumption behind the business model and innovate by creating a different way of delivering value propositions. Any questions now?
So if anyone has a question for Mela, now would be the last window. If you have any questions about time pledge in more general manner, don't hesitate to ask that as well. In the meantime, before a question comes in, next week we will have another time pledge virtual conference, but it will be an open one like last week. So that means that we have 1 or 2 mentors online, and whoever wants to connect and ask questions that they meant to ask, they'll have an answer. The last edition worked very well. And we are now going to do it every 2 weeks. So that is next week on May 6th. I might have the day wrong. No, May 6th. And then on May 13th, we will have Megan Johnson doing a presentation on an introduction to user experience. Let me share my screen just for a little form we have that we would like you.
So there is a question from Kennedy on the business model canvas. Just a second, let me see, because I lost it now that you switched. So it says, do you create multiple business model canvases if you have multiple customer segments with different needs? Or if you have multiple value propositions for one customer segment. If you have multiple value propositions for one customer segment, most of the time you will actually do these on the same canvas, unless if they require completely different resources in order to produce them. So if you're trying variations of the value proposition, so they're not component parts of a value proposition, but they're variations, you will do separate BMCs. If they are related and they're produced in the same way with the same resources, or related in terms of pricing, for example, then you will keep them on the same business model canvas. When you have multiple customer segments, again, only keep them on the same canvas if the majority of the other components are shared. So if the value proposition is shared, or the resources that you're using to create it are shared. You will also keep multiple segments on the same canvas when it is a multi-sided platform, because you want to see this relationship between the segments as well. Otherwise, you will keep separate canvases. And generally, as a rule of thumb, it is useful to color code, actually, customer segments and value propositions. Similarly to, if you remember when we had the Accor hotel example, the event organizers were different color to the travelers, and the value proposition that was linked to the event organizers were also a different color. So it allows you very quick to identify which value proposition and which component parts are linked to which customer segment. Super. Thank you.
We have also a question from Sai. His question is, are VC investors accepting the business model canvas as part of the pitches?
Most VCs actually appreciate it, because you will probably note we had a presentation a couple of weeks ago on pitching, and actually the structure that Matteo used for the pitch to a certain extent also follows some of the component parts of the business model. So many investors nowadays appreciate using either the full template or a part of it, because it allows them to see the one, you know, the thinking that you've put into it, but also the overall structure of the business model, especially if you can comment on things like its strength, stickiness, weaknesses, and so forth.
Thank you very much. Any last question? Well, we actually have more time, so if you have more questions, go ahead. But I feel like everybody has asked the question they had. And therefore, we will be closing. So as I said, we will be back next Wednesday at 5 p.m. until 6:30 p.m. for a more open-ended session. The week after that, it will be the introduction to user experience with Megan Johnson. You will receive our newsletter with all of that content and summaries of sessions. If it's not done yet, please give us a follow on Twitter at timepledge.org or on Instagram at timepledge. If you have any questions, feel free to send me a message to my email address that I will put in the chat right now for everybody. This session will be on YouTube starting Monday. The beginning of the presentation. Yeah, so I perfect, like there is two things. I'm not sure if Mela is willing to share the slides, but
of course, yes.
Okay, so whoever would like the slides, please send me a message and we will share that with you directly. And in terms of this,
I can also share as well, if anyone is interested, I actually have a separate a set of questions specifically for innovating using the business model canvas, so I can share that one as well.
Okay, so what we'll do is we'll send to all attendees the presentation, this extra material Mariela just talked about, and as soon as the whole session is on YouTube, which is usually the case with our sessions, you will be notified as well. Okay, on this, thank you all of you for joining us. Thank you, Mariela, for this amazing and very clear presentation. And
thank you, everybody.
A great evening.
Cheers. Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.
Thanks again.